Hello and welcome to this MZ webinar on labour market insight for programme approval, and thank you very much for joining us for this. I lead on MZ's engagement with universities in the UK, and I was keen to talk about this because it's an area that a lot of our clients are using our data for, and I thought I should share some of the good practice that we see and some approaches to how universities are applying employment and labour market data to this process. First of all, just a quick introduction to MZ. We are a labour market data and economic consulting company. We provide labour market data to a number of sectors, including the higher education sector. We work with universities right across the UK, but also in our other markets in North America and Australia, for example. But our mission is to use labour market data to inform and connect people, education, and employers. And to that end, we work with, as I said, universities, but also FE colleges. We work with local enterprise partnerships, local authorities, central government departments, as well as large corporates and staffing organizations. I'm not going to read through this slide. The slide is here for your reference, but when we talk about labour market data, I think it's important to be clear that we're understanding the same thing. So there are three key areas of data that MZ work with. The first is our core LMI, the labour market intelligence, labour market insight, labour market information, whichever I you wish it to be. This in the UK is data that is drawn from official statistics. They're all official statistics. They come from the ONS, and we use 8 of their different data sets. And this is updated annually. It goes back to 2003, so we have a very good time series which allows us to run projections forward, which is very useful if you're planning degree programs, because you're not going to have graduates in the following 6 months or indeed the following year. You're looking for 5 years forward, so being able to project with robust basis for those projections is important, because we've got those large scale data sets, and we have those at a really good granularity. So we've got them at local authority level, which we can then build upwards, and we have the occupational information to 4-digit level, the most granular. So that's coded in according to SOCs. So we have 4-digit SOC codes, and the industry equivalent we have at 4-digit SIC as well. Alongside the economic data, the official structural economic data, we have job postings analytics. This is big data. We process about 800,000 to 1 million job postings every month. And what you see here is a bit more detail. So you're beginning to see from these online job postings who the employers are, which towns within the local authorities are showing the demand. You're seeing advertised earnings, not just the earnings that people report that they are earning, which we get from the official statistics, but we can see what companies are advertising. We can also see what skills they're requiring, hard skills and soft skills, and we can of course see which employers are hiring individually. So it lifts the lid slightly. Have to be a bit careful with job postings data, because in the end it is big data. One job posting does not equal one job. If you are recruiting 20,000 shelf stackers, you don't necessarily put out 20,000 job advertisements. The same time, if you're recruiting I don't know, a director of marketing, you might put advertisements in multiple places for one job. Or you might not advertise at all because you're using an executive search firm. So you have to be a little bit wary of using job postings as an economic indicator. But if you've used the official statistics to give you those economic indications and you know where to look, then it's really helpful to see employers and skills and all of that. The third area of data that we use are profile analytics. This is essentially CV data, of course, GDPR compliant, but when people have applied for jobs through a job portal, which many companies require, or recruiting companies or job boards as well, various different portals that people may enter their CV data into, and they've ticked a box which says, I'm happy for my data to be used for analytics. So what we've done is take that data and we have broken it down and normalized some of the key variables so we can count them and then link that back to other data sets like the job postings analytics, like the structural data. But again, we can see employers, we can see skills, we can see location. So it's a really interesting insight into the current labor force as is. So those are our data sets. This webinar is first of all going to look at, okay, why are we taking the approach that we're taking, how we then do that. So looking at mapping of programs to data, how that's applied, and then some of the insights that we can then draw from that mapping and the tools that we use to actually find those insights. And then finally, I'll just touch on some of the other ways that this type of data is being used in universities. So if we start with why. So in the program approval process, when you're looking at new programs, you usually have to go through a process that looks at a range of external factors. So things like student demand data, competitor activity, as well as then a range of internal factors like alignment to internal policies, the QAA's subject benchmark statements, and the academic coherence of the proposed program in terms of the wider portfolio. Many of the external factors will be addressed in the business case, while the internal factors tend to be looked at in the context of a program specification. Labour market insights can play a role in both, but today we're just going to focus really on the first part, which is the business case. So the key question that features particularly in business case requirements and has gained in importance since the TEF and the increasing focus on graduate outcomes is, what's the evidence for industry demand for graduates with the proposed degree? And there can be different approaches to how you tackle this and the evidence that you provide. But what is clear is that the OFS requires that degree programs make students more employable, that there are positive employability outcomes for students who take that degree. Also, the QAA in the quality codes, advice and guidance for course design, make clear that as well as referring to external sources when designing programs, and of course external sources would include labour market data, but also that programs should be market relevant. And we did an event with the QAA in December 2019, and we discussed this with them, and they were quite clear that market relevant is not only talking about relevant to student demand, but also relevant to employer demand, the employment market. So how do we go about making the link between data and programs? So firstly, and this does start with the assumption that the course creation process hasn't begun with the relevant labour market data. So firstly, a connection needs to be made between the academic and skills content of a programme and the labour market. This can be through defining likely, intentional, and reasonable career outcomes from a proposed programme. So for example, if you want to be a management consultant, is it likely, intentional, and reasonable that you would study retail management? Might say, well, if you studied retail management specifically, then that's an indication, a reasonable and likely indication that your intention is to work in retail management rather than generalist management consulting. So that's the type of question to ask oneself. And of course, this is easier for professional and vocational programs than it is for the more creative and arts and humanities programs. Those courses that don't have such a clear definition in terms of the labour market can be viewed perhaps instead through a skills lens, because we can map the skills data to likely good fit occupations as well. So in EMS's labour market research tool Analyst, for example, we provide a 3-digit JAX code mapping to 4-digit SOC codes. As I said before, those are the most granular definition of occupations within the official economic statistics. And this provides a really helpful starting point in generating those links. You can then make links to industries through something called an inverse staffing pattern. And those show in a particular geography which industries are employing those occupations in question. Because an accountant could be working in the construction industry, or they could be working creative advertising agencies. So understanding which industries are employing the occupations you're looking at are important. If you were using a labour market data led approach to drive program creation, then there are other techniques you might use. So you might include assessing the strength of the different industry clusters in your region of focus relative to the rest of the country. And you might then be looking at the graduate outcome, the graduate occupations within those industries. So that's something we can look at the data for a bit later. But there are different ways you can make, but here is the mapping. And you can see on the slide that we've got some example occupations that we've mapped JAX N50 marketing programs to. The second example is physiology, JAX B12. Now you can see physiotherapists have their own SOC code, 2221. But in this suggested mapping, we've also got medical practitioners. Now, you might look at that and think, well, do I want to include that particular mapping? Because medical practitioners includes doctors, GPs, and their earnings can be significantly different to physiotherapists. And so you might want to have that conversation internally as to whether or not you would want to include that outcome when you're making that mapping. And you might look to your alumni data on that. Your Delhi data might help, or to give some insight as to what do people go on to do, or indeed where they progress on to in terms of master's programs and other postgraduate courses. Is it reasonable to include that 2211 medical practitioner SOC code in that mapping? It's more of an art than a science. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, but you have to be wary of these questions and have a consistent approach. What about those humanities programs? So here we've got French literature, and here are some example mappings that you might have from French literature. Now, you might look at your alumni data at that, and you might see, well, actually, the majority of our French literature students go on to do a law conversion program and go into the legal profession. Well, then do you map your French literature degree to a legal SOC code? Then you may do, but I would suggest if you're doing that, you make very clear in any messaging communications that may then come from the data that you're taking from this program, either internally or externally, and particularly externally to students, that you're making it clear that the outcomes that you are seeing for these students is based on the fact that they won't work in a field directly linked to the program of study that they've undertaken. So you'd want to have that thought process and honesty in the way that you then communicate the outcomes. I think certainly likely intentional and reasonable outcomes are those which are listed there. Of course, I think in terms of messaging, you might be thinking, but that you are not restricting outcomes to those things, but those are likely reasonable and intentional. But if you're messaging to students in your course pages, you might go on to say, many of our students also go on to do this, and this program is a great basis for actually then converting to another field like the legal profession. So that's just something to bear in mind. And what you use for your data in terms of program approval may not be always the same as what you then go on to message to your students, but the main thing is you're being honest and being open and transparent about that. Whichever approach you use, that map of occupations to the program is going to be needed, but depending on which route you take, whether it's the mapping first or looking at the local economic data first to give you ideas for programs, that may mean it's not your first step, but in the end you will want some mapping to occupation codes, because that gives you the access to the economic data and that very long time series of robust data and the ability to look at robust projections forward. Place is also fundamental. What is your region of interest? Now, I've covered that in a blog article on our website called Universities and Place, which you can find on the website. But universities have access to data that shows them where their students come from, to a limited degree where they go to. Universities also know who their external stakeholders are when it comes to research and knowledge exchange. Moreover, they know where they are situated. It's an obvious point, but nevertheless, it's one that can be overlooked. And at EMSI, when we produce free labour market insight reports for universities, we usually use LEP regions as an easy proxy for a university's region of interest. But of course, this may not reflect reality. It could be too small a geography. It could be, in reality, you draw students from the entire, let's say the largest grouping of students you have come from your government office region, such as the West Midlands, for example. It could be you're a very local university and you do draw from primarily from your LEP region. It could be you draw many students from right across the country, but actually when you look to the groupings of students into employment, the biggest grouping of students is actually going into employment in your local area. And then when you look at other demographics, so for example, if you're looking at particular demographics like widening participation groups, I've been told by University Connect, UniConnect, or NCOPS, National Collaborative Outreach Programs, that those groups of students very much do prefer to stay and work in their home region. They work and study in their home region. So you need to define place. And as I said before, with the data, we have all the data to local authority level, which you can then build upwards, and you can create your custom geography or radius from a place, but it allows you to apply a geography consistently to the data you're looking at. So, using the data. So the labour market data you're associating with the proposed programme needs to be applied in a way that clearly establishes the case, the business case. High location quotients for industries or occupations associated with the programme are a really good way. They're a very effective way of demonstrating alignment with local labour market needs, because they show your region's strengths and peculiarities in comparison with the rest of the country. So where there's a lower location quotient than perhaps you'd like to be seeing in the data, there are also other areas of data to look at that could also help you make a case. So other factors could be jobs growth, annual openings. So those are job opportunities owing to churn rather than to growth in new positions per se. Earnings, median highest levels of educational attainment in the geography you're focusing on. You know, in this type of data, as you can see on the slide here, a screenshot from our system, and any parts of these data can be extracted from the system and clipped or downloaded into a Excel or to a Word document, etc. But the table we're looking at here are occupations associated with JACS code N50 marketing. We've taken 7 local authorities here, which are in a 30-mile radius from Basingstoke, where EMSI are based. So this is the imaginary University of Basingstoke region of interest. And what we can see here is there's quite a strong location quotient. There isn't much growth, but there is relatively good churn. Another example, in this table here, we have a 20-mile radius from Doncaster, looking at occupations relevant to JACS N30 finance. And so looking at location quotient, it's not really a specialism of the area, but there are jobs and there is growth and there is some churn as well. So the fact it's not got a very high location quotient might make you think, if you're in this area, is this really an area of strategic interest for us to be investing in? That's not to say there aren't employment outcomes, that there are jobs, there is growth, there is some churn, but then if it's not a high location quotient, you might then be thinking, right, perhaps we really need to be looking at pay a bit more attention here then to the competitor market. So this is where you might be looking at the HESA data. Certainly when we do this type of thing in our consulting teams on behalf of universities, we looking at the HESA data to see, okay, what's the supply of graduate labor in these occupations looking like. And this actually will be something you'll be able to see in Analyst towards the end of 2020 as well. So that will be exciting in itself. Here we have what I mentioned before, the inverse staffing patterns. Again, we're using the same radius from Doncaster, but in this data we look at the marketing occupations. And what you can see here is the ability to explore which industries are employing those occupations in that geography. And that's really helpful, particularly for a course where it's a kind of X for Y title, accounting for the construction industry, for example. It probably wouldn't be that, but that gives you a sense of where you can start to really understand where the opportunities might be, and whether your proposal really does match up with what is a reality in your local area. On the next slide, again, looking at Doncaster, but this is what you might be using if you have the labour market-led approach to answering this employability question. Because here what we've done is list all the occupations in the area, filtered for those which have as the median highest level of educational attainment in that geography as a bachelor's degree, and they've been listed according to the jobs growth rate, which we've also highlighted the column with the figures on annual openings as well. So when you're looking at job numbers and earnings data, it's really important to consider the time frame you're looking at. So as I said before, we've got this longitudinal structured economic data that goes back to 2003, which enables us to generate trend-based projection 9 years forward. Now, this means you could consider what the job market is projected to look like once your students begin graduating in terms of the availability of jobs, so growth plus churn, and that's relevant to their program of study. Now, of course, it's not possible to predict every eventuality, and all of us are feeling that right now with COVID-19. But this is a far more robust basis of evidence than guesswork or anecdote. And of course, to address the elephant in the room when it comes to economic projections, which is COVID-19, yes, that will have an impact. That will not really come through in the ONS data that we use until towards the end of the year. The data that we're seeing at the moment is including all of Q1. So the January and February data, which averages out with March data, isn't really helpful to see the impacts. We are going to start to see unemployment benefit data coming through, and we will see that unemployment data coming in. That will give us some indications as to which industries are being hardest hit, and which occupations indeed. And it's that's certainly something we're going to be keeping tabs on, and you can see some of the data have on the dashboard on our website for COVID-19. We are producing those reports as well, which you can request from our website for your LEP region. But really what those reports all do is they use the job postings data to show which areas are being hit, because that gives us an indication as to where hiring is reducing. That's the most immediate data. The claimant counts will be the next bit of data that comes through, and that will be showing up in Analyst, our tool. So that will be a good place to go and see that data. And what you have, so the job postings data, the claimant count data, that's the data you would have to maybe go to see where the impacts are most likely. And if you're using MC tools, having those mappings to occupations, so the taxonomies that we have between job titles in the big data to 4-digit occupations is really helpful to allow you to make that mapping back to the structural data and to interpret, okay, which occupations are perhaps more likely to be hit, and that gives you an indication on industry as well. So it is possible to make some judgments with the data. And of course, when the new data does come through from the ONS and the impacts that are there, that will impact the projections that we have as well. So hopefully that addresses that to some extent at least. Another area, another approach, should I say, to having this labour market data first method of approaching program development might be looking at the industry clusters in your region of interest. This is one of the tools we've got where we have clustered industries into 49 groups, and these are basically ecosystems of the different types of businesses that operate within a particular area, like the visitor economy or creative or digital industries. And what this does is map those clusters against two variables. One is national growth, the other is the local location quotient. So those industries where your local area there is a high location quotient, and so that means you have a comparative advantage, and there is national growth as well. That's the top right hand quadrant, those are strengths. Top left hand quadrant, the opportunities, where you have some presence but not yet a comparative advantage, but there is national growth. So those are areas of opportunity. And economic developers, your local enterprise partnerships are really interested in those. But also in the bottom right-hand quadrant, the risk areas. So where you have a strong presence, but also there's a national decline. So if you're running a program review area, it's worth keeping an eye on those clusters of industries as well, because how relevant are they going to be in your region 5 years hence? So that's something to keep an eye on. It's an interesting tool to use. Using the data, there are again other data points to think about, where job numbers can be broken down by growth rates, annual openings, and they can be benchmarked against other regions. Earnings data also can be looked at in different ways. So universities obviously like to think about graduate earnings, as that's what's reflected in the statutory metrics. So looking at the lower centiles of median pay within an occupation can be a good indication of this. You can see that there in the table. And then alternatively or additionally, as you can see in the inset there on the slide, advertised earnings from job postings can be used. And we capture any instances of compensation levels in the advertisements that we process in our job postings. So this can add a layer of insight into current demand, and it can be overlaid with skills data as well, if there's a particular area of specialism that's developed by a program. So examining the data variables we've been looking at can help provide an evidence base for the answer to strategic questions as to whether there's an industry demand for a program, an employer demand for a program. Naturally, academics and insight managers may wish to supplement the data with personal insights they may have on employers, they have links to or knowledge of. And of course, those insights only become more valuable when they're backed by sound empirical evidence as well. In a later webinar, we will look at how questions around employability and particularly skills can be addressed in the program specification using labour market insights. So do keep an eye out for that. I did say at the beginning that I would also comment on the strategic value that universities derive from using labour market data beyond the program approval process, which on this slide would, I suppose, come under enhancing employability in portfolio planning and course design. But we have student recruitment and careers guidance teams using the data. They're messaging to potential students as well as existing students on the alignment of programs to careers, areas of job growth, alumni outcomes, particularly with the profiles data that we have. We have, as well as employability teams, the teams that work on placements, degree apprenticeships, alumni employment, those teams that interface directly with employers using the data. So yes, universities will have their own links through research or just historical links or links through their staff with employers, but also thinking strategically, which industries do you really need to be plugged into in your region, or which occupations are really prevalent across industries in your region, and then understanding, okay, which are the significant employers. And you have to bear in mind as well that universities, the teams that interface with employers will often interface with larger employers, because they're going to have more opportunities for placements and employment, and maybe more opportunities for people to come in and speak to students, or they may pay the levy, so they're an interesting target for degree apprenticeships and what have you. But local economies are made up of lots of small businesses as well, and actually their demand may be lost slightly in the picture that universities have. So again, the economic data will pick that up, and so it's good in a way to capture the whole of the economy, and not just that of those really massive employers that universities may typically gravitate to. Research impact, REF, KEF, for example. So in KEF, the proposed KEF, local growth and regeneration, again, that requires an understanding of the local economy. And I know already lots of universities work very closely with their LEPs on this, and many LEPs will be already use EMSI data, but it doesn't really matter where they're getting their data. They will be using ONS data as we do. And so being able to talk to them in their language is important. I suppose I've kind of skipped to the civic engagement there, but where you're looking at research impact, being able to put the research impact in terms of the context in which it's happening. So for REF, it's research impact. For other activities, maybe the knowledge exchange, but being able to show impact in its local context, whether it's jobs, whether it's a process improvement that researchers created, being able to show how important that is, how significant that is within a local industry or within the local occupational context. You need to have the economic data to do that. And so that's how this is being used. But as I said, if you're then interacting with those wider stakeholders who are interested in that, so like your LEPs and local authorities and so on, they are also using this data, and it becomes that common language that you're using, so you can better work together with those partners. And that really comes into its own when universities are working as anchor institutions and working on their civic engagement. So just some ideas as to how else this data is being used. I hope that was helpful. These are my contact details, and certainly if you have any questions or you want to discuss this further, you have other ideas, really interested to talk to you. And if you're interested to see more of the data, do reach out. Very happy to give you a little tour of what there is and how that might be useful to you. But thank you very much for joining.